In 1933, unemployment in Germany stood at 6 million people, nearly 30% of the workforce. 4 years later, it had virtually disappeared. The Nazi regime accomplished what democracies across Europe and America couldn't: full employment in the midst of the Great Depression. Economists called it a miracle. Workers called it salvation. The world watched in stunned admiration. But there was no miracle. What happened in Germany, and later in Italy, Spain, and Japan, wasn't economic recovery. It was something far more sinister: the deliberate transformation of employment into a weapon of total control. A system where having a job didn't mean freedom. It meant surveillance, coercion, and complicity in crimes against humanity. This is the story of how fascism didn't just promise work. It made work itself a tool of oppression. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history are woven together to shape the world we live in. The crisis that made it possible. To understand how employment became a weapon, we must first understand the chaos that preceded it. The Great Depression didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed faith. Between 1929 and 1932, global industrial production fell by nearly 50%. In Germany, the Weimar Republic watched helplessly as unemployment exploded from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. In Italy, real wages had already fallen 40% since the end of World War I. In Japan, the collapse of silk exports devastated rural communities, creating mass desperation. Democratic governments tried traditional solutions: balanced budgets, wage cuts, deflationary policies. They failed spectacularly. The social contract between citizens and states began to fracture. Breadlines stretched for blocks, families lost homes. Young men, educated and skilled, found themselves without purpose or prospects. This wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a crisis of meaning. And into this void stepped a new kind of politician, one who understood that people didn't just want jobs. They wanted belonging, purpose, and the restoration of national pride. Fascist movements across Europe and Asia made a simple promise: give us power and we will give you work. Not just any work, meaningful work in service of a reborn nation. But how would they deliver on this promise? And what would be the true cost of employment under fascism? The blueprint of compulsory labor. The fascist employment model didn't emerge from economic theory. It emerged from war. During World War I, every major power had implemented some form of labor conscription. Germany's Hindenburg Program of 1916 mandated compulsory civilian labor for the war effort. Italy's industrial mobilization placed workers under quasi-military discipline. These systems demonstrated something crucial. When framed as patriotic duty, populations would accept levels of control that would be unthinkable in peacetime. Benito Mussolini, who took power in Italy in 1922, was the first to systematize this approach. In 1926, his regime passed the Rocco Laws, which abolished independent trade unions and strikes, replacing them with state-controlled corporations that grouped workers and employers by industry. The Ministry of Corporations, established in 1926, didn't just regulate labor, it dictated who could work where, under what conditions, and for what wages. This was presented as class collaboration, the end of Marxist class warfare through national unity. In reality, it meant workers lost the right to negotiate, to quit, or to organize independently. Employment became a privilege granted by the state, not a right negotiated by individuals. The model spread. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, he studied Mussolini's system carefully. Within months, he would adapt it, expand it, and transform it into something even more totalitarian. But first, he needed to solve the unemployment crisis, and he needed to do it in a way that would bind German workers to the Nazi state forever. The machinery of full employment. The Nazi employment miracle began with a lie, or rather, with creative accounting. On May 2, 1933, the day after May Day celebrations where Hitler promised to honor German workers, stormtroopers occupied trade union offices across Germany. Union leaders were arrested, assets were seized, independent labor organizations were dissolved overnight. In their place, the regime created the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, The German Labour Front, a massive state-controlled organization that every employed person was required to join. This wasn't just union busting, it was the systematic destruction of workers' ability to organize independently. Then came the jobs programs. The Reich Labor Service, made compulsory in 1935, required all men aged 18 to 25 to serve 6 months in labor brigades. They built roads, drained swamps, and constructed infrastructure, often with hand tools rather than machinery, deliberately maximizing employment numbers. Wages were minimal, conditions were harsh, and refusal meant criminal charges. Simultaneously, Hitler launched massive rearmament programs that violated the Treaty of Versailles. The 4-year plan, announced in 1936, directed resources toward military production. Steel plants expanded, aircraft factories multiplied, shipyards hummed with activity. By 1939, nearly 50% of Germany's industrial output was dedicated to war materials. The unemployment statistics dropped dramatically, from 6 million in 1933 to 302,000 by 1939. Nazi propaganda celebrated this as proof of Hitler's genius. But here's what the numbers concealed. Millions of workers weren't employed by choice. They were assigned to jobs by state labor offices. Changing jobs required permission. Leaving a position without authorization could result in fines or imprisonment. Under the 1938 Decree for the Registration of Manpower, the state gained power to conscript any civilian for any work deemed necessary for the national economy. Jewish workers, meanwhile, were systematically excluded from this system. First through the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, then through escalating restrictions that barred them from most professions. By 1938, Jews couldn't own businesses, work in civil service, or practice law or medicine. Employment had become explicitly racialized, a tool not just of control, but of exclusion and persecution. In Italy, Mussolini's system evolved similarly. The Charter of Labor, proclaimed in 1927, declared work a social duty. By the late 1930s, internal passports restricted movement between cities. Workers needed state approval to change jobs. Agricultural laborers were forbidden from migrating to cities without authorization. Japan's approach, while different in mechanism, achieved similar control. The National Mobilization Law of 1938 gave the government sweeping powers to direct labor, capital, and resources. The Industrial Patriotic Society, created in 1940, organized workers into company-based units under management and state supervision, replacing independent unions. Across fascist states, a pattern emerged. Full employment achieved through compulsion, surveillance, and the elimination of worker autonomy. But this raised a question that few dared to ask. If people couldn't refuse work, couldn't negotiate conditions, and couldn't leave jobs without state permission, were they employees at all? Or had they become something else entirely? When work became slavery, the transformation from coerced labor to actual slavery occurred gradually, then suddenly. In Nazi Germany, the shift began with the outbreak of war in September 1939. The regime faced an immediate problem. Millions of German men were being conscripted into the Wehrmacht, creating massive labor shortages in factories, mines, and farms. The solution was to import workers by force. Polish prisoners of war became the first wave. Then came civilians from occupied territories, initially recruited with false promises of good wages and conditions. When volunteers proved insufficient, the occupiers simply rounded people up. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, Einsatzgruppen and military units seized working-age civilians, loaded them onto trains, and shipped them to the Reich. By 1944, foreign workers and prisoners of war constituted approximately 20% of the German workforce, roughly 7.6 million people. But these weren't guest workers. They lived in barracks, surrounded by barbed wire. They wore identifying patches marking their nationality and status. They received subsistence rations. They could be beaten or executed for minor infractions. German companies, including Krupp, IG Farben, Siemens, and Volkswagen, used this forced labor extensively, working people to exhaustion in mines, munitions plants, and construction projects. The Labor Front's early promise of strength through joy, the Kraft durch Freude leisure programs designed to win worker loyalty, became grotesque parody. While German workers enjoyed subsidized vacations, foreign slaves died in factories. Then came the concentration camp labor system. As the Holocaust industrialized, the SS established camps specifically designed to extract labor from prisoners before death. Auschwitz III Monowitz, built to produce synthetic rubber for IG Farben, worked prisoners under conditions so brutal that average survival was measured in months. Dora Mittelbau, where V-2 rockets were manufactured underground, killed an estimated 20,000 workers through exhaustion, starvation, and deliberate murder. This was employment as extermination. Vernichtung durch Arbeit, destruction through work. Italy followed a similar, if less systematized, trajectory. After Italy's armistice with the Allies in September 1943, German forces occupying northern Italy seized Italian military internees and civilian workers, deporting approximately 600,000 to Germany as forced laborers. In the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state in the north, labor conscription became increasingly coercive as the war dragged on. Japan's system, while distinct, was equally brutal. In occupied Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, the Japanese military and affiliated companies conscripted millions for labor in mines, construction projects, and munitions factories. The comfort women's system represented perhaps the most horrific weaponization of forced labor. Tens of thousands of women, primarily Korean and Chinese, forced into sexual slavery under the guise of wartime employment. The breaking point had arrived. Employment under fascism had completed its transformation. From compulsion to exploitation, to slavery, to systematic murder. Work had become a weapon not just of control, but of genocide. Accounting for the unaccountable. When the war ended in 1945, the Allies faced a staggering reality. Millions of displaced persons, traumatized and stateless, wandering through the ruins of Europe. The forced labor system had created a humanitarian catastrophe on an almost incomprehensible scale. The Nuremberg trials attempted to assign accountability. Industrialists from Krupp, IG Farben, and Flick were prosecuted for their use of slave labor. Fritz Sauckel, who had overseen the forced labor program as plenipotentiary for labor deployment, was convicted of crimes against humanity and executed. The trials established a precedent. Companies and individuals who benefited from forced labor could be held criminally responsible, but accountability remained incomplete. Many companies paid minimal reparations, if any. The Cold War created new imperatives. West Germany needed to be rebuilt as a bulwark against communism, which meant that prosecuting every business that used forced labor became politically inconvenient. Former Nazi officials were integrated into the new German state and economy. Justice was selective and limited. In Japan, the situation was even more problematic. During the American occupation, Emperor Hirohito was shielded from prosecution for political reasons. Many companies that used forced labor, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Nippon Steel, continued operating with minimal disruption. The comfort women were ignored entirely. Their stories wouldn't receive international attention until the 1990s. Italy largely escaped accountability. The focus on German and Japanese crimes allowed Italian fascism's labor abuses to fade from international consciousness. Mussolini's corporate state was dismantled, but few individuals faced serious consequences for labor exploitation. The economic fallout was equally complex. Germany's post-war economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, was built partly on infrastructure and industrial capacity created by forced labor during the Nazi era. The autobahns, the industrial plants, the technological expertise, all inherited from a system built on slavery. This created a moral paradox. Post-war prosperity had roots in wartime atrocities. For survivors, the psychological damage was permanent. Forced laborers who returned home often found that their own governments were indifferent to their suffering. Soviet authorities were particularly harsh, viewing former forced laborers with suspicion as potential collaborators. In many cases, victims received no recognition, no compensation, no justice. It would take decades for the international community to fully reckon with this history. Germany established compensation funds in the 1950s, but significant payments didn't occur until the 1990s and 2000s. The German Foundation for Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, created in 2000, distributed approximately $4.4 billion to former forced laborers. Japan's compensation remains controversial and incomplete to this day. The fallout revealed something profound. When employment becomes a weapon, the wounds don't heal with the regime's collapse. They persist for generations. The return of compulsory labor. The collapse of fascist regimes in 1945 didn't eliminate forced labor. It simply transformed it. Today, the International Labour Organization estimates that approximately 27.6 million people worldwide are subjected to forced labor. This includes state-imposed forced labor in private economies, and forced sexual exploitation. The mechanisms differ from 1940s fascism, but the core principle, employment as coercion rather than choice, remains disturbingly persistent. The most direct modern parallel exists in North Korea. The regime's Songbun system classifies citizens by perceived loyalty, determining access to employment, housing, and food. The state assigns jobs. Refusing means facing criminal punishment. Labor camps, called kwanliso, hold an estimated 80,000 to 120,000 prisoners in conditions comparable to Nazi concentration camps. Workers are leased to foreign companies in China and Russia, with wages paid directly to the North Korean government. A state-run forced labor export system. China's system is more sophisticated, but equally coercive in specific contexts. The crackdown on Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang has involved forcing hundreds of thousands into vocational training programs that function as compulsory labor. Workers are assigned to factories producing textiles, electronics, and other goods for domestic and international markets. Several investigations have documented that major global supply chains, including those for solar panels, cotton products, and consumer electronics, have been contaminated by forced Uyghur labor. But forced labor isn't limited to authoritarian states. In democratic countries, prison labor systems create similar dynamics. In the United States, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime. Today, approximately 800,000 prisoners work for either government-run operations or private companies, often earning pennies per hour. While prisoners theoretically volunteer, the reality is more complex. Refusing work can result in loss of privileges, solitary confinement, or denial of parole. Some scholars argue this constitutes a form of coerced labor that echoes, if not replicates, historical forced labor systems. The gig economy has introduced new forms of employment coercion. While not comparable in severity to fascist forced labor, algorithmic management creates situations where workers have limited autonomy, face constant surveillance, and can be deactivated from platforms without due process. Employment becomes contingent, precarious, and subject to opaque corporate control. A distant echo of the fascist principle that work is a privilege granted by power, not a right negotiated by individuals. Perhaps most revealing are the climate-related labor concerns emerging in the 21st century. As states respond to environmental crises, questions arise about compulsory labor for climate mitigation. Could governments eventually mandate environmental service? Under what circumstances would such systems remain democratic rather than coercive? The history of fascist employment systems provides a cautionary answer. When states gain power to assign labor in the name of national emergency, the slope toward compulsion is dangerously steep. The pattern is clear. The weaponization of employment didn't end in 1945. It adapted. The challenge for democratic societies is recognizing when employment policies cross the line from regulation to coercion, from social responsibility to state control. Because history has shown us exactly where that line leads. The lessons we must remember. The story of how fascism turned jobs into weapons teaches us three crucial lessons. First, full employment is not inherently good. The Nazi regime achieved near-zero unemployment, but that success was built on compulsion, slavery, and genocide. Economic statistics mean nothing without examining the human rights conditions underlying them. When politicians promise jobs without addressing worker autonomy, labor rights, and freedom of movement, we should remember the German labor front and ask, employment for what purpose, under what conditions, and at what cost? Second, the erosion of worker power happens incrementally. The transformation from trade unions to state-controlled labor fronts didn't occur overnight. It began with emergency measures during crisis, justified as temporary necessities for national recovery. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, coordinating labor for economic efficiency, preventing disruptive strikes during recovery, ensuring vital industries had adequate workers. But each step also eroded the ability to resist the next one. By the time the system became overtly totalitarian, the mechanisms for resistance had been systematically destroyed. The lesson: defend labor rights and independent organization before the crisis, because during the crisis, it's already too late. Third, employment is fundamentally about power, not just economics. Fascist regimes understood what modern technocrats often forget. Controlling how people work means controlling how they live, think, and resist. When employment becomes contingent on political loyalty, when changing jobs requires state permission, when work itself is framed as a privilege rather than a negotiated exchange of labor for compensation, the relationship between citizen and state transforms. People become subjects rather than citizens, dependents rather than participants in a free economy. These lessons aren't historical curiosities. They're warnings for the present. As we face 21st century crises, economic disruption from automation, climate change, geopolitical instability, governments will face enormous pressure to implement large-scale labor programs, to coordinate economic activity, to sacrifice individual choice for collective necessity. Some of these measures may be necessary, but the history of fascist employment systems reminds us to ask critical questions. Who controls these programs? Can workers refuse participation? Are independent labor organizations allowed? Can people change jobs freely? Are employment decisions made by economic logic or political loyalty? The difference between a jobs program and a forced labor system isn't always obvious at the outset. It's determined by whether workers retain fundamental rights to organize, to negotiate, to quit, to be treated as autonomous individuals rather than instruments of state policy. Because in the world of wealth and power, history never ends. It just changes hands. The question is whether we'll learn from it before the patterns repeat. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just rewrite what you thought you knew about power.